Welcome to Classic Screen, a show where I watch a classic movie as blindly and as ignorantly as I can each episode, without research, without context, without a catchy tagline, although after watching I then do my due diligence as a film journalist and try and retrospectively fill in the blanks where I can. Now, I was originally going to do a different movie this week, but I had a conversation with my dad after the last episode of Classic Screen where I reviewed Shane, which was his favourite film of all time, I believe, and he put some historical context as to why Shane is portrayed, in my words, as the Milky Bar Kid, this cookie cutter cowboy who drank soda pop instead of alcohol and a number of other things. He's basically the Milky Bar Kid. You can listen to that episode to check out what I had to say in greater detail if you're interested. And who knows, maybe I will have my dad on at some point to give us some of that much needed historical context as someone who was around at the time, and I mean the time the movie was released, not the time of the Old West, although sometimes you would wonder the way he goes on. But anyway, he recommended a movie called Hombre as a kind of polar opposite to the kind of portrayal of heroism we get in Shane. Hombre, by the way, was a movie he taped off the TV, which if you try and explain the concept of how that works to anyone under 18, they will probably look at you like you are from the Old West. So there you go. So Hombre, directed by Martin Ritt, a director I'm a little familiar with. He did a movie called HUD, also starring Paul Newman, who he frequently collaborated with, and Paul Newman is also the star of Hombre as well. Paul Newman is one of my favourite movie stars of all time. I think he's great. He's probably halfway between the charisma of Tom Cruise and the kind of on-screen mobility and presence of somebody like Marlon Brando. If you think of movies like The Hustler, HUD, Cool Hand Luke, he certainly excelled at and was probably interested in exploring alternative heroes, if you can call them that. I mean, there is this saying, I don't know who said it, and I'm certainly going to butcher what they actually said. What else is new, I suppose. But the saying goes, if you spend enough time with a character, whether it's in a book or a film, you're inevitably going to feel some sort of sympathy for them and root for them on some level. Now, of course, I would argue that it depends on how well the character is conceptualized, firstly, but also it's kind of because they are filling the role of protagonist in our story. So it's our natural instinct to feel that way to an extent anyway. You know, you have somebody like Henry Hill in Goodfellas or Michael Corleone in The Godfather. If you are going to get into a conversation, if these guys are good guys, quote unquote, if you go through a checklist, they're not. Of course they're not. But in the story and in this world, we get to know them. It's their story, their eyes we're looking through to an extent, so they fill that role. So you do get that kind of good guy rub, if you will, just by them filling that role in the movie. We are instinctively rooting for them in the same way we would a hero. You know, the cops become the bad guys, other mafia gangs become the bad guys as well. So the mechanisms work in the same kind of way. What's so interesting about Hombre is the character that Paul Newman plays, named John Russell, is not only filling that role of hero for the audience based on that natural instinct to root for and sympathise with that we as audience members feel for our protagonists, but he also fills that role for the other characters in Hombre by circumstance. It's very interesting actually in this movie. They are looking for virtues and heroic attributes and a champion, if you will, in this deadly situation from somebody who doesn't actually have those characteristics. However, based on a combination of circumstances and by acting out the hero's beats and hero's journey without having any of the actual heroics and without seeing any softening of his edge or change in his personality as the story goes on, we get this strange sort of dichotomy that you don't know if you're watching a depiction of a hero minus the myth or a depiction of a man finding himself in a position aligned with vulnerable people. So therefore his questionable ethics are viewed in some way as heroics. It's one of the most complicated looks at the myth of the hero that I've seen, for sure anyway. I think Unforgiven, the Clint Eastwood film, does it fantastically as well. We are rooting for Clint. We all love Clint. He is our hero, our protagonist, by virtue of the role he is filling and by virtue of whose story we are following. And you know, we definitely want to see Gene Hackman get his comeuppance, but the magic of that movie unfolds in the scene where all the most chaos unfolds in the bar, and at the same time we get our revenge and bloodlust fulfilled. Another feeling starts to creep in regarding the wider ramifications of what it means to have a wild man like Clint Eastwood's character let loose. Then we, not to say switch our allegiance, but in that moment we start to realise that Gene Hackman's character was trying to do something as well that was perhaps much more noble than we thought. But up to that point, they are filling roles in the story, and we of course are naturally aligned with who we think the hero is. Now, of course, Gene Hackman's character was by no means a hero, and certainly despicable as well. But the genius of that movie is, once our bloodlust has been satisfied, almost in that moment, the hero's journey and slaying the beast fades away into something else entirely. It's like once the primal side of you is satisfied, immediately the intellectual side of you takes over. You start to have a much more complicated reaction about what you have been actually watching. I was certainly left with that very question by the end of Hombre as well. Now, a little bit more background about the movie. So Paul Newman plays John Russell, this cowboy who was raised by Indians and is kind of forced to engage with society a bit again when he is left this house after, I guess, his father dies or something like that. He inherits it anyway. Now, I love these movies, like for instance The Last Samurai or Dances with Wolves, where we get a character from one culture that ultimately learns more about another culture and integrates into that culture, and by the end of the movie the plight of that culture and those people become his cause too. Like in Dances with Wolves, Kevin Costner is a soldier assigned to a remote military outpost during the Civil War, and it kind of borders with Indian territory, and he gets to know them, and you know, as the movie goes on, he kind of switches allegiances, which usually happens in these kind of movies anyway. Well, the great thing about the starting point of Hombre is that it's at the end of that process. Paul Newman has already embedded himself within that culture. He has taken on their cause already. He is Indian, really, in many ways, to an extent, although, of course, he has the benefit of transitioning back into the white man's world when he wants to. But why it's such a great starting point in this movie is, and again, why this movie does a great job in the discussion of heroics and ethics, is that while he might have right on his side, if you want to call it that, regarding how the Indians have been treated, again, what this movie does brilliantly is we don't get the kind of Tom Cruise Last Samurai Crusader character. We don't get Kevin Costner Dances with Wolves Indian activist. We get a bitter man who is resentful. We get a man who let this atrocity erode his humanity, his compassion, and his engagement with people in general. Well, regarding the white man and white woman anyway, he's pretty uncompassionate towards. And by pairing him with a bunch of characters of well-rounded, well-written people in a situation where they are vulnerable and relying on him, makes his character even less sympathetic based on how it goes and how he carries on. So we could have had this character who has right on his side, crusading and lecturing the white man on their actions. I'm talking easy targets like the cavalry and generals, but instead we have this character lecturing and being resentful about these things to characters who are pretty much ordinary folks trying to make a living and surviving like everyone else. And his kind of detachment from that does this great kind of mirroring of how many people felt detached from the Indian people suffering because it didn't really have anything to do with them. So there is this great story within a story of how all it takes for bad things to happen is for people to do absolutely nothing, basically. And in Hombre as well, we get all the common archetypes we normally get in these movies as well. But I think the characters are so superbly written, well, most of them anyway, that it takes those archetypes that have been run into the ground and gives them this new perspective and a new kind of insight into them, no matter how little and how minor the character is. They all feel very well rounded. This female character called Jessie, played brilliantly by Diane Cilento. Like, we have seen that type of tough as boots, street smart woman in these western towns a million times before. It's become a kind of beat sheet of moments to hit with these characters. It's a real cliche. You can usually find that character in any western movie, but the way that the character is written and the way she is so well written in this movie, it just revises that type of one-note performance so much and gives us all this kind of wonderful characterization and dialogue that's usually missing from those characters. This is an adaptation from an Elmer Leonard book, and of course his books have been adapted before with great success. Out of Sight, Jackie Brown, 310 to Yuma, Get Shorty, or is it Get Short? No, Get Shorty. Justified, the TV show. Now, I haven't read his books at all, but what I do know is that when it comes to adaptations, he's got a pretty good success rate. The characters in this are all really good, even the minor ones, as I've mentioned. They're all really engaging. The bad guys are captivating. Richard Boone is the main bad guy in this and has a great screen presence. But it's funny, actually, Paul Newman's character is actually much more dishonourable than him when it comes to tactics in a lot of instances. I mentioned Diane Cilento a minute ago. Her character Jessie was really well written. Well, I'd say all of the female characters in this are really well written, actually. And I hate to be that guy. Oh, it's great to see such well written female characters and highlighting that fact separately. But I did really appreciate the perspective that they were given in this movie. It really added a lot to it, and I read after that the movie was written by a husband and wife writing team, Harriet Frank Jr. and Irving Ravitch, so maybe that has something to do with it, or maybe it is in the source material. It's hard to know, but the dialogue is really sharp and biting, lots of memorable lines and a lot of scenes that really push the characterization of everybody in very well thought out ways. Now listen, everyone knows I'm a big Western guy. It is my favourite genre probably. Maybe sci-fi as well, I would say. But Hombre is part of the canon of great Westerns as far as I'm concerned. It's certainly one of the top examples of a Western subgenre I particularly love as well. the revisionist Western. I think in recent years, the revisionist Western has been less interested in perception and ethics and much more interested in having a go at this traditional Western archetypes. And I think there is a difference, because there is a certain nihilistic greyness to the best revisionist Westerns that I love that seems to be missing from modern day revisionist Westerns, which are much more interested in kind of tearing down statues, if you will, rather than asking questions. So I really appreciated Hombre. I think it's a must see, really. Oh yeah, just one more point about Paul Newman in this, by the way. In movies like The Hustler and Cool Hand Luke, he has bags of charisma. There is even a montage of his smile in Cool Hand Luke, for God's sake. And that charisma just makes you gravitate towards him so much naturally in those movies, which makes it even easier to root for him and his flawed characters that he plays. But in Hombre, it's like he turned off that side of him completely in this wonderful, subdued, cold performance that makes him extra unlikable. It's always great when you discover this extra layer to an actor's ability, especially regarding an actor you admire so much. So yeah, I guess I've said all I can say about Hombre. Hopefully painted a good enough picture as to why you need to see it, and I hope if you do, you enjoy it as much as I have.